I think history helps us to understand what makes people in different cultures tick, why people get angry and passionate, sometimes extremely passionate about certain controversial topics, and why they admire passionately and sometimes extremely passionately admire figures or have great feelings about events.
Hey, I'm Cody Mitchell, and welcome to the Daily Declaration podcast. In this episode, I talked to Solomon Schmidt. Solomon is an American historian. He wrote his first book at the age of 12, and since then has published 7 more. In this episode, we talked about the importance of learning history, both at a cultural level and for individuals. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the podcast, Solomon.
Thanks for having me, Cody. Great to talk to you.
It's great to talk to you. Just to kick off, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to love history?
Sure. I went to private school from K to 5th grade. I live in New York, in the USA, for anyone who couldn't figure out that it's in the USA. That was a joke. After private school from K to 5th, I was homeschooled the rest of the way till graduation. I've been writing books about history for several years now in a series called History Bites, B-I-T-E-S, in the sense of little bites of history. I wrote mainly for kids. That's how I started off. But as I continued writing and had conversations with people who read them, I realized that they were useful to some people who were older, grandparents, parents, not just young kids. And doing that history book series led me eventually into doing a history YouTube channel called History Bites YouTube channel. So I've been working pretty much full-time on that for, I would say, 6 out of the last 7 years, in addition to my homeschooling, which I finished up back in 2020.
Yeah, awesome. And how many books have you read, just for the record? Not read. How many books have you written?
8 total, and they're all in the History Bites series.
Yeah, nice. It's awesome. So you mentioned that you're kind of targeting a pretty broad audience, but your main target group are young people. My first question is, why is it important to expose young people in particular to history?
I think of a couple things. Something that's been in front of me more recently because of my newest book called Great Adventures, History Bites, has been the idea of role models. And the more I think about that, the more I've realized that when I was young, and I'm sure this was your experience, Cody, history gave me role models, people to look to for how I wanted to not only shape my career choices potentially, but also the kind of person I wanted to be. And I think that's one very important reason why young kids should learn history, because I don't think you're ever too early to get what you believe are good, positive role models. I was in Tanzania a couple months ago, and to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and also to film for my YouTube videos about David Livingstone and some other explorers. And we visited, me, my brother, and dad, who went on the trip together, we visited a school for orphans in Tanzania, and the principal walked us through the school as the guests for the kids to meet. And they were all wonderful little kids. And they raised their hands and asked us some questions, some general questions about America. But then one of the children, I think he was probably only 6 or 7 maybe, asked my dad, "Who is your role model?" And that really got me to thinking about that idea of role model, which led to the answer I gave you just now. Another thing I thought about recently, because of, again, a trip. I was in Norway and Iceland last week. It's a long story, but basically I was there for business, again, related to my YouTube channel, filming about a well-known Norwegian explorer named Thor Heyerdahl. And what I realized while I was there is how much impact one person can have on a country. And while we were there, I saw statues and monuments to Thor Heyerdahl. I saw murals painted on buildings just as I was driving by, sometimes not because I was looking for them. He's popular and influential in that country. And for young kids, learning history, not just about people, but also events, it helps them realize, I think, what makes people in their specific countries tick, what makes people angry, what gets people fired up, why people admire historical figures from their country. And I think knowing about your country is a way you can help make it better, if that's what you want to do. I think that's another important reason why young people should learn history. And my last point that I had thought of here was a more practical one that I've encountered, and I'm not sure if you have, Cody. I've found that the more I learn about history, not just U.S. history, which of course is the country where I come from, but history of Great Britain, or when I talk to you, the history of Australia, or the history of Tanzania or Norway, what I've realized is by having more general knowledge, it enables you to have intelligent discussions that I couldn't have had if I hadn't read a particular book or watched a documentary or a YouTube video about general information. In this day and age, most people probably don't know in the United States what essentially the Great Depression was, or that's an example, but even basic, what would seem to me like basic topics until I learned about them, a lot of people don't realize anymore. So being able to read history and expand your knowledge that way is, I think, a great way for young kids to have more intelligent conversations as they get older, be able to connect with more people, whether they travel or not. But as you know, you can communicate with people anywhere over the internet now. That's how you and I met. That's how we're talking right now. You know, those were a few reasons I thought, but I'd be interested to know what you thought as well, if you were able to share that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Like they're all fantastic reasons why I think young people should get that understanding of history. And I loved in particular your first point around role models. That's something that I've thought about a lot. And it's almost this parallel between we have role models in real life. It might be our parents, grandparents, people who we meet and live alongside. And in some ways, what history does is it allows us to expand that learning from our elders, but even beyond people who are alive with us at this point in time.
Do you have anyone in your life like that, Cody?
A living person or a dead person?
I guess both.
Yeah, no, there are plenty of people in my life. I've been privileged to to have role models from grandparents to my parents are amazing role models, and something that probably in some ways helped me to appreciate history, and how we can also learn from people in the past. Like a few of the things that you mentioned in your responses there, I think we'll probably touch on over the next little while. But one of the things that you often hear from people, I do at least, I'm sure you do as well, Solomon, is, well, I'm just not interested in history. Do you think that that's, I guess, always true, and that some people can just not be interested in it? Or do you think that has more to say about the way that someone was taught history than about history itself?
That's a very interesting question. I think it's difficult to answer just because of the very simple fact that I haven't talked to every single person in the world. You know, each person has such a different experience. I think I've been able to go to many different places in the United States, not as long as some people have, of course, but I've went to a fair amount of conferences, homeschool conferences and educational conferences to exhibit my books. And along the way, I've met a lot of really kind, smart people. And this is a little anecdotal evidence, I guess, but in the experience I personally have had, I have met, and I can think of off the top of my head one very specific example of a person who I would consider who is very smart, intelligent, who knows a lot, general knowledge, like we were talking about earlier, who does not like history as a subject, but to I think if I'm understanding, if I remember the second part of your question right, I think if we forget about the word history, there are people interested in good stories? I think so. I'm sure they are. I've never met a person who isn't interested in good stories. I got to thinking about this recently when I was starting my series of YouTube videos about great adventures based on my book. And one of the videos I was making was about John Wesley Powell, who you may be familiar with. He was a American explorer who was the first man to lead an expedition down the Colorado River into the Grand Canyon. It's a fantastic story. He was a one-armed Civil War veteran. Unfortunately, 3 of his men died along the way, so it's not fantastic in that sense, but it's very interesting. And what I got to thinking was when I was titling that video, I was thinking about all different titles, some very formal, some with the word history in them, and then I was looking at what other successful YouTubers do, people like Mr. Beast or Ryan Trahan, other very popular YouTubers, and seeing what their titles were and realizing that you just got to show people that this is an interesting story. It's an interesting video. So after talking with some family and friends of mine, I decided on the title, One-Armed Civil War Veteran Takes on the Grand Canyon. Enough said. It's a fantastic story, whether it happened 150 years ago or whether it happened yesterday. A lot of the stories from history that we know, Cody, if they were on the news today, would be front page news, and in their day were front page news. Men like Thor Heyerdahl, who I talked about a minute ago, who I went to Norway to film about. He's not only famous in his country, but during his day, he was on the cover of Life magazine and the New York Times because his expedition was incredible. And now it's another piece of history. In its day, though, it was a great story. So I think stories from the past, not necessarily the quote subject history, can be interesting to anybody, for sure.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and the way that you distinguish between history as a sort of academic subject and history as a story. It's something I've experienced talking to people who, particularly people who are involved in the school system, is they get this idea of history as dull and about memorizing boring facts, but really history is, as you point out, it's a story. It's a thrilling adventure so much of the time, and yeah, that's really brilliant. The point you raise about if they happened today, they would probably be frontline news. So no, that's really good, and it kind of segues into my next question, which was, what do you think both parents and teachers could do to make history more engaging? Part of the answer might be, tell it more in a narrative form.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, and I'm not an expert in these things, Cody. I don't have the one answer that's going to solve all the issues, as you know. The thing that comes right to the top of my head is find engaging content and tell it. Like you just said, having a narrative, having a story. And to your point a minute ago, I remember doing history in private school, and I had a very, very good teachers, very smart, capable teachers. However, the curriculum, it wasn't so much history, it was called social studies. And even when I would take statewide exams as a homeschooler and they would test me on social studies, which history was supposed to be, I guess, kind of a branch under, what I realized through reading the questions and looking at the material was that it was a lot to do with anthropology or economics, which I know is fascinating to a lot of people, but that is not what I thought of for history. I always wanted history, quote unquote, to be its own subject. But I think at the end of the day that there's enough material, whether it's military history or adventures or political leaders. I mean, take your pick. There's so many options. If teachers or mothers or homeschool dads take it and try to tell an interesting story, or find books that tell an interesting story, or podcasts that tell a good story, I think that's going to get not just kids, but people of any age interested. And that's what comes to my mind. I'd be curious to know what you think about it.
Yeah, no, I love that. It's kind of this idea of history as something that it has something for everyone because it's so broad. Like there's some people who, like myself, are more interested in the history of ideas or of warfare and theology and religion and that kind of thing. And there are some people who are more interested in maybe the history of economics and structures and civilizations. But it definitely does. It has something for everyone, and so. And we'll probably touch on this towards the end of the conversation, but being able to find a method of teaching that tailors the kind of history that is taught to the interest of the child is probably a really good way of doing it. But yeah, before I ask you about that, digital media is something that you're increasingly involved in. You mentioned your YouTube channel, a lot of the video stuff you're doing. How important do you think that using media like video, maybe audio, web content, and that for explaining and teaching the next generation history? How important do you think that is?
I think it's very important, not only evidenced by our conversation right now, which of course is being recorded on the internet, but also in the sense, also through the use of downloaded content on iPhones, YouTube, which of course is an part of the internet. However, I think books will be around forever. Maybe they won't be read as much. Certainly they're not read like they were 70 years ago. An example that comes to my mind, one of the people I interviewed on my YouTube channel was a man named Alan Dershowitz, who's a well-known lawyer here in America and a professor. He was a professor at Harvard University for about 50 years. And when he was young, he and his friends in New York City, they would spend their afternoons free on Saturday or Sunday or whenever they had time free, not, of course, on the internet or on their phones. They would spend it talking about intellectual subjects, or reading, sitting around with a candy bar and reading. And from what I've seen, that's gone in a lot of ways. Everywhere I go, whether it's restaurants or airports, you name it, there's especially a lot of young people who are, you know the phrase, glued to their phones. And I'm not judging anybody. I've done my fair share of work and fun on my iPhone, in the sense of fun and engaging videos. And iPhones are very practical now for work, like sending emails from anywhere. You don't have to pull out your computer. But I think that digital media, in tying to that point of the iPhone, is very important, because you, as historians, I don't think we should be looking at the generation we have now and saying, how can we bring them back to everything their parents did? Because, as you know, Cody, it's just not possible, and it doesn't make sense for what we have. I think YouTube is a wonderful, wonderful way to engage and bring topics that are in books in front of kids who will never open a book. And again, I tie it back to my point earlier. If we can find content that is interesting, important, and relevant, and put it out there, hopefully kids will be drawn to it. And by modeling successful YouTubers, some of their techniques, whether it's their description of the video or their thumbnail or their title or the pace of the video or the text inside the video or the graphics or whatever it may be, if we can take methods like that, or even popular interview methods, and apply them to history, to good stories, I think it could have a big impact on our generation, the generation of the iPhone. And ultimately, Cody, if you have a dramatic event or a really cool story, you don't need to make content or write books telling people this was a dramatic event, this is a cool historic event. You just need to tell what happened, and people are smart, whether they're adults or kids. They'll figure out if it's dramatic or cool or historic or funny, whatever it may be. I guess that's my full answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I mean, I'm absolutely a lover of physical, real books, as you are, and so I guess this is not about books necessarily, as you alluded to. It's not against books versus digital media. In fact, one of the things that I hold out hope for, and maybe it's vain hope, is that through engaging people with historical content online and in the media that people are using, we can maybe spark an interest in people to explore further in books and some of the more traditional forms of reading history and discussing it with people. Do you see it that way?
Yes, absolutely. And there are channels on YouTube. Again, I go back to the YouTube example because it's what I'm most familiar with. I see channels of people not only traveling to talk about history, but showing people their library. And when you can find niche content, for example, I know we share a love of The Lord of the Rings. There are whole YouTube channels devoted to just certain aspects of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, whether it's related to his mythology, or book collectors, or film critics on YouTube. Some of those channels can bring us back to physical books. Like if I was able to turn my camera around right now, which I would do, but I don't want to disrupt the video, I could show you some books I have on my shelf that are special editions of different J.R.R. Tolkien books that fans like you and I love and buy. I mean, there's one right behind you, as you were showing me earlier. I think there are plenty of ways to tie it back to physical books. And I don't know what your take on this is. I don't see necessarily the importance of using physical books over ebooks. If people like ebooks, I don't see the difference there. As long as they're reading the same content, that doesn't matter to me. However, the time that authors put into their books, good books and well thought out books, can be one of the benefits, as you know, to reading, to actually picking up a physical or an ebook and reading it, because for the most part, an author will have put a lot of time and effort into thinking about these topics, whereas, again, I'm not telling you anything new. YouTube videos or a lot of online articles I have found can be extremely inaccurate. That's the simplest way to put it. And in some cases, there's no citations, so people don't know where facts come from or how they can be verified. And when there's differences in internet articles, if it's a subject I don't know, it's confusing to me because I'm not sure who to believe, if you know what I mean. I might have veered off on a rabbit trail from what your original question was.
No, that's all good. In fact, that's probably a whole nother worthwhile conversation that we could have around, verifying information and ensuring accuracy and stuff. But yeah, probably we could have a whole conversation about that. Another thing I was wanting to ask you about is sort of zooming out to a more cultural level. Why is it important for civilizations and countries like Australia, like America, like Western culture as a whole, to have an awareness and clear understanding of their own heritage?
I believe it's important. It's significant to people's lives for a few reasons. The first one I think of is, it kind of ties to a point we were discussing earlier. Learning history can help you understand your specific country's historical, political, and religious backgrounds. For example, take the country of Nepal, which is right in between India and China on the world map, and you may be familiar, is where the Himalayas run through, and Mount Everest is also located there. The more I've studied that particular country's history for some of my YouTube videos and a trip I made there last year, the more I've understood why, for example, I think it's about 80% of the country practices the Hindu religion. And that goes back to 250 years previously, when a man named Prithvi Narayan Shah conquered the Kathmandu Valley and made Nepal a Hindu state that was closed to foreigners, which is why when Edmund Hillary first scouted the Mount Everest in 1950, I believe it was, he had to do it from the north side at first, and there were climbers only allowed on the north side where China had access. And then in 1952 or 1953, Nepal opened up. So by learning history, you understand why all of that happened, why practical issues that affect us today, or that affected people like Edmund Hillary when they went to go get a climbing permit and Nepal was closed to them. Learning history is practical. It helps, I think, it helps you in a practical way with general knowledge. I've used that term probably 2 or 3 times in this interview, but it just keeps coming back to me. History helps you be a smarter person, not necessarily a wiser person. I don't know what your take on that issue is, but I think smart and wise are 2 different ideas. History, learning it, definitely makes you smarter, not in any arrogant or nerdy way, although I suppose some people would consider you and I nerds, Cody. It gives you general knowledge. And another very important issue I think of when you ask about people learning their heritage is you understand other people's grievances. Two examples from here in the United States, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. The Native Americans here, the indigenous First Nations here in the United States. There is a case to be made that the white European settlers of present-day America stole much land from the Native Americans. There's cases both ways in that issue. But at the end of the day, when you go to a state like Arizona, where I was back in June, you see the difference between land owned by the U.S. government and land owned by a Native American reservation. The U.S. government has allotted them specific regions, but they do not have, I believe, the same level of benefits that we do. And I'm not an expert on that topic. However, when you go on to these Native American reservations here in our country, you notice a difference in the ability of their economy to make a good standard of living that those people there deserve. And that has roots in a conflict that happened, in some cases, 400 years ago. Learning history helps you understand their grievances. That's an example I think of. I'm sure you have many examples, or some examples in Australia. One other one that comes to my mind here in the United States is when I travel in the South, there is still a lot of contention over the issues related to the American Civil War. Up north, for one specific example, up north, our Civil War is called the American Civil War. I'm from New York, so that's what I have learned to call it, or the war between the states. When I go down south and talk with different pro-Southern people, they will refer to it as the War of Northern Aggression, Lincoln's War, terms like that. It's a completely different view on the same topic. And I once met a woman in Virginia. This is a little anecdotal piece, I guess. I once met a woman in Virginia about 5 years ago at a conference in Richmond. And I remember it very clearly. She was an older woman, probably in her 60s or 70s. And she was talking to me. We were having a conversation about Robert E. Lee. Nothing too political. Politics is no business of mine with history. In matters concerning history, I don't get into politics. We were talking about Robert E. Lee, and this older Southern woman started welling up with tears, even talking about Robert E. Lee. And she said something to the effect of, Robert E. Lee is like George Washington to us down south. And that was an important moment for me, because up until that point in my life, I hadn't only heard the northern perspective of the war, but that was what I was perhaps more familiar with. And I realized that people even today, 160 years after our Civil War, still have grievances. And again, it ties back to history. And these are real, living, flesh and blood people that if anyone up here in New York State drives down to Tennessee and you have conversations with Southerners, some Southerners will feel very passionately about these things, and I wouldn't understand it unless I had read about it or watched a informative, engaging YouTube video that made me want to learn more. And I think I already mentioned earlier, so I won't go into it again. But one of the things I was very impressed with, not only in Norway related to Thor Heyerdahl, but also in Leif Erik's I had a slip there, in Iceland when I went there a couple weeks ago, was the number of statues built to Leif Erikson, who scholars believe, as you know, based on a saga, they believe that Erikson was born in Iceland, in a place today that's known as Hawk Valley. And he's very significant, even still to this day, to many native Icelanders. Same thing with Thor Heyerdahl, or as they call him, Tor Heyerdahl in Norway. And they only know that because people have taught them, whether it's through basic things, basic objects like plaques, or again, podcasts, interviews, TV shows. It informs us. And it helps us understand history. Helps us, again, to reiterate, I think history helps us to understand what makes people in different cultures tick, why people get angry and passionate, sometimes extremely passionate about certain controversial topics, and why they admire passionately, and sometimes extremely passionately admire figures or have great feelings about events. I know that's a non-specific summary. It takes me back to the words I used at the beginning of the question: general knowledge. History is helping us become better informed, more intelligent, understanding, and perhaps caring people at the same time. But that's not my issue to tell people how they should take in history. Everyone is smart. They can figure what lessons they want to deduce from history out themselves. It's not my business. With history, historians, I think, and I'd really like to know your thoughts on this, Cody. I have for several years thought about this phrase that historians should be journalists. I think there's a difference between journalists and commentators. Perhaps we have a lot of commentators today, which I'm not saying is a good thing or a bad thing, but I think there is a difference between a journalist and a commentator. And I believe historians should be journalists of the past to the best of our ability, or whoever wants to be a historian to the best of anybody's ability who's looking at history, has an interest in history, reading about history, and wants to tell it to other people through whatever medium they think is good for them, that they should be taking whatever records they're studying and interpret them in as accurate, logical, interesting a way without adding their own personal opinions. I know that's a very cliched idea, that you're trying to, quote unquote, remove your bias, as I hear. And the response to that I get quite frequently is, you can't ever take your full bias out of things. Fair enough. I think that's completely reasonable. But you can work at it for sure. And I believe it's important. And like I said, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's not something that I've come to a solid position on, but I think fundamentally we need a solid, objective set of facts from which we can work. I think some of the best cultural commentators and today are people who have a great awareness of history. But the thing is, they're not doing history at that point. They're doing cultural commentary on the basis of an understanding of history. And so I think, yeah, you've got to differentiate between those. So I think broadly, I agree with you, although it's something that I've got to think about more. There's one, before I let you go, there's one more question that I'd love to ask you, and it's about your upbringing. You were homeschooled, as was I. How did you find that being homeschooled maybe fostered or shaped your interest in history?
Thanks for the question, Cody. I said earlier I came home in 5th grade, which is a very significant time because when you're young, you're starting to develop your interests, hobbies for your career, whatever. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. When I came home for homeschooling, first of all, my parents purchased and had me use and had me be taught through online courses subjects in history that were specific, not just generic social studies, quote unquote, social studies, but specific courses focused on U.S. history, world history in different time periods, U.S. government, which includes the U.S. presidents, which one of my books is about. That being able to focus on stories from history, significant people from U.S. history, helped lead me into an interest in writing a book about U.S. history for kids, which was U.S. History Bites, my first book in 2016. And was also the fact that my mom gave me a lot of books and constantly put books on the shelf or took me to the library to check out as many copies, as many books as I wanted to. One of my books in the History Bites series is about C.S. Lewis. Well, my mom was the first one to buy me a set of the Chronicles of Narnia. I still remember the day I got it. I'm sure you have moments like that where you, whether it was a present or specifically a book that stick with you, and that one does. And it eventually led me to have an interest to write a book about C.S. Lewis. And so when I think about homeschooling, not only did my parents foster an interest, but they also, in a good sense, stepped out of the way and let me read voraciously in some cases. But homeschooling also gave me the freedom in my schedule to work on what I wanted to work on. And that was very important to me at that stage in my life, because when I went to private school, I would work very fast. I would get done before every other kid in my class, and I can still see myself in that class waiting for other kids who were slower. It wasn't their fault. It was they had a harder time going as fast, and sometimes that was a drawback for me because I didn't get as good of grades as I should have. But my point is, I wanted to move on to other activities. And so when I was homeschooled, I would be able to get up at an early time, which I prefer, work through all my subjects without any mandatory breaks for recess or lunch, which are good things, I think, but they weren't required on me. And then once I was finished with my school, sometimes I would have 6 hours in a day. After working 6 or 7 hours at my homeschooling, I would have 6 hours left in a day to work, in a lot of cases, completely on my books, whether it was researching, writing, editing, graphic designing. Homeschooling gave me the ability to do that. you know this, Cody. Homeschooling's not for everybody. At least I don't think so. Some people really enjoy sports, engaging with people. Not people, because my family and some of my friends are, I'm sure they would consider themselves people, but a wider network of friends, a social community that you see around the clock all throughout the day, and evening at sports practices and night at sports practices and on the weekends at sports practices, on Sundays at sports practices. That wasn't, for me, my deal. I liked, like you do, talking about history. I love history. And homeschooling gave me the freedom to do my books because of my parents, and also because I was able, to an extent, to determine my schedule from grade number 5 to when I graduated.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, no, very similar experience for me. That flexibility was amazing. Yeah, Solomon, it's been really, really great talking to you, and you had some awesome insights into some of the things we've talked about. Just before we finish up, would you like to tell people how they can see more of your work and follow you online?
That'd be great, and I'd appreciate it. My website is historybytes.com. You or anyone else can see all my books there, and a link to my YouTube channel, and some interviews I've done on different shows, and some very special people who have reviewed my books. Historybytes.com, historybites.com. And I appreciate what you said, Cody. Somehow I think you could have done a far better job answering the questions than I did, but I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you get a lot of other interviews for this podcast or YouTube channel, or I guess it's both. Is that right? It's both, right?
It is both.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
awesome.
Oh, so
Thank
I've
you so
been
much,
recorded
Solomon.
on video this whole time? Oh, okay.
No, that's awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Cody.
really appreciate your time, and yeah, thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you in the next podcast.